Okay, welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. This is your second video for week 8. So today we're going to be talking about cognitive dissonance and cognitive dissonance reduction. So that's the topic for today. We're going to be looking at how this specific capacity of our mind relates to reasoning in a variety of different areas. This has turned out to be a really important kind of aspect of cognitive reasoning. Hello and welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. This is your second video for week 8, and today we're going to be looking at cognitive dissonance and cognitive dissonance reduction. So let's get started. First of all, I want to remind you of a kind of guiding question that we've been thinking about through this course, and that is just what is the mind? Something that we've said before about what the mind is it is perhaps the sum of mental behaviors, that is the sum of things that it does. So we can just define the mind functionally in this way by talking about the things that it does. So that's kind of led us into this quest where we've been thinking about, well, what are the specific things that the mind does? And we've talked about a variety of different things the mind does. We've talked about perception, language processing, and so on. But one thing that the mind does that we haven't talked about yet is serve as its own defense mechanism, okay? So the mind has a kind of defense mechanism built into it, like your body has an immune system, and it protects it from problematic cognitions. And so this is what we're going to talk about today, talking about cognitive dissonance, is the kind of defense mechanisms that the mind has to protect itself from problematic cognitions or problematic ways of thinking. Now, what kinds of problematic ways of thinking are we talking about? Well, today we're going to be talking about inconsistent ideas, desires, beliefs, and just in general, inconsistent cognitions. So the mind in some way needs a way to protect itself from having too many of these ideas, desires, beliefs, or other cognitions that are inconsistent with one another. And so we're going to be looking at the mind's defense mechanism for dealing with these inconsistent ideas. We might ask, though, why are inconsistent cognitions bad? So let's say a little bit about that first. Well, first of all, if I believe that two things are the case, right, then I face a challenge or problems of indecision, right? So suppose I believe both that bush over to the left is the best place to forage, and this bush over to the right is the best place to forage. If I believe both of those things, well, those two things are inconsistent, and there's going to be a cost to that indecision. I'm not going to be able to solve the problem of where I should go because there are two answers that the decision process ends up delivering, right? So I end up dithering in this case, not deciding. So because there's this kind of cost to indecision, inconsistent cognitions are bad. Additionally, some of the cognitions we're talking about here, some of the thoughts are goals or desires, right? So things that we want to achieve. And you can imagine that if we hold inconsistent goals we want to achieve, then that is going to make planning difficult. Our plan for goal A might end up undoing our plan for goal B. And then also there are costs associated with social aspects of life that could arise from having inconsistent ideas, thoughts, or beliefs, right? So there's a social cost to saying that you believe P in some cases, and also then in other cases saying you don't believe P, like people will distrust you, right? It's like imagine like saying, oh, I back the badge to this one group, and then saying to this other group, I do not back the badge, right? That is something I would never say. Well, then obviously people are going to grow to distrust you in that case, right? So for each of these reasons, having inconsistent cognitions, and again, these cognitions, we're talking about these broadly, like propositional attitudes, ideas, desires, beliefs, and so on. These inconsistent cognitions are bad. They're costly from a kind of natural selection point of view. And there are additional reasons we could point to as to why inconsistent cognitions would be bad. So the thought behind cognitive dissonance is, well, given that there's a cost to having inconsistent cognitions, well, that is just what we're going to call cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is the inconsistency in our cognitions, okay? And it's bad. Cognitive dissonance is bad, right? We don't want to have that in our system. And cognitive dissonance reduction is essentially the defense mechanisms that our mind employs to guard against there being this kind of cognitive dissonance built into our mind. Okay, so as Festinger, who is the father of a lot of this work, and we're going to talk a lot about his work today in preparation for the reading that you're going to be looking at in the next few days. Festinger and his co-authors write that dissonance and consonance are relations among cognitions. That is, among opinions, beliefs, knowledge of the environment, and knowledge of one's own actions and feelings. Right, so these are what dissonance and consonance are. This is a relation among these cognitions. And he says also, two opinions or beliefs or items of knowledge are dissonant with each other if they do not fit together. That is, if they are inconsistent. And I think here, we don't want to put too fine a point on inconsistency. Philosophers talk about inconsistent in some special ways, but I think maybe more is conveyed by what Festinger, Reichen, and Schachter have in mind in this book. With the first component, they do not fit together. So that's basically what we're thinking about. Two kinds of cognitions that don't fit together in our cognitive system. If two cognitions do not have this property, if they do not have the property of not fitting together, then they are consonant with each other, right? So consonance or dissonance is always a relation between two specific beliefs or two specific cognitions, okay? Or between, we might think of it between a single cognition, a single new belief, and the existing beliefs that we have within our system, okay? Okay, so there's a basic idea that Festinger and his co-authors rely on, and this is a kind of principle of cognitive consistency. So the idea here is that the human mind is driving towards an overall consistent system, right? So again, we've just been talking about some of the ways in which dissonance is bad. It causes us to dither, it causes us to lose social standing, it causes us to plan to goals that are in conflict with one another. So we've been talking about these ways in which dissonance is bad. And the thought is, because dissonance is bad from a natural selection point of view, then evolution, natural selection, has selected for human minds that find dissonance unpleasant, right? So human minds that want to avoid dissonance are those that ended up evolving because dissonance was a bad thing, right? So since dissonance is unpleasant to us, we seek to eliminate or reduce it whenever we can. So this is a further principle built into this idea of cognitive consistency. And now Festinger's work, who we're talking about again, he's the father of this kind of idea of cognitive dissonance. His work explored our various means of reducing cognitive dissonance, okay? So we're going to talk about what some of those means are. And cognitive dissonance and cognitive dissonance reduction have now become major areas of cognitive research. So the key idea to getting a sense of what cognitive dissonance or how cognitive dissonance functions is going to be conveyed. I'm actually going to rely upon a study that Festinger and Carl Smith did in 1959. I'm going to refer to three different works, essentially, of Leon Festinger's in this talk. So one of those is When Prophecy Fails, which was published in 1956. And that's kind of case study of a doomsday cult. We'll talk about that near the end. The other work I'm going to talk about is Festinger's solo published Theory of Cognitive Dissonance. So I'll say some words about that as we go along. And then in addition, there's an article, that last one came out in 1957, I believe. And then the last article is the Festinger and Carl Smith article, which reports a laboratory experiment demonstrating dissonance. And that comes out in 1959. So we're going to talk about that one first, even though it's kind of the latest article. Okay, so in this article, published in 1959, Festinger and his co-author, Carl Smith, he has various co-authors in these different works, argue that dissonance comes in degrees, okay? So I think we can think of it this way, right? So it's very unlikely that all of our beliefs fit together with one another, right? We probably hold some cognitions that don't fit with other of our cognitions. But for any one of those cognitions, um, well, if we look at that cognition in isolation or that belief in isolation, I'll just talk about belief here to make it simpler. If we look at that particular belief in isolation, right, like maybe the belief that the Packers are going to win the Super Bowl, right? Just take that as an example. So for that belief, there might be various other beliefs that we have that fit together with that belief, that are consonant with it, and others which are dissonant with it, right? So for that single belief that the Packers are going to win the Super Bowl, we can judge its dissonance to the system as a whole by imagining what the other beliefs are, or by realizing what the other beliefs are within the system as a whole. Okay? So that belief the Packers are going to win the Super Bowl, it may be somewhat consonant with my other beliefs, right? Whereas some other belief, right, like the Brewers are going to win the Super Bowl, may be quite non-consonant with other of my beliefs, right? So we can think of dissonance and consonance as coming in degrees. And so here's a more specific example, okay? So suppose that you have the belief that cigarettes are bad, okay? You might have various cognitions that are consonant with this belief, right? You might realize that smoking causes coughing and shortness of breath. You might know that smoking can cause long-term illness, and so on, right? So each of those beliefs are consonant with this new belief you've been introduced to that cigarettes are bad, but there are other beliefs that are dissonant with that belief, right? So maybe you know smoking is relaxing, it makes you feel nice. Smoking makes you look cool, that's good too, right? And there are other things here that are dissonant with the belief that cigarettes are bad, okay? So we can judge the dissonance of the belief that cigarettes are bad, this new belief, relative to the system as a whole by thinking about what are the other beliefs that system has and which ones fit together with it and which ones do not fit with it. Write another example. So suppose we have the belief 2020 could still be a pretty great year, right? Well, there are certain things that are maybe consonant with this. I think, well, maybe the Packers can still go to the Super Bowl. They can still pull it off. And there are other things that are not consonant with it, right? I mean, there are other things that are consonant with it. There's a big election coming up. I think maybe that'll go the way that I want it to go, right? So maybe that's going to be something that's consonant with this belief that 2020 could still be a pretty great year. But there are also things that are dissonant with it, right? Still 2 months left for bad stuff to happen in this year. And you know, we've gotten our hopes up before. I've gotten my hopes up before about things and then had them dashed and so on, right? So for this belief too, we can think of things that are dissonant with it or consonant with it. And now Festinger gives us a kind of calculus for moving from these consonant and dissonant beliefs to an actual kind of calculus to tell us how dissonant the belief is with the entire system. So here's how this kind of calculus works. What Festinger suggested was you could tell the degree, or you could roughly represent the degree to which a belief was consonant with the other cognitions in the system as a whole by sort of adding up the dissonant cognition. So we think 2020 could still be a pretty great year. And I first think, well, what's dissonant with that? What doesn't fit with that idea? Well, here's one. I'm going to give these each a value of 1. In truth, Festinger, to add a complication to this, thinks that these might be weighted in different things. So different things might be more and more important to us, right? But we're going to suppose that all of these dissonant cognitions are of equal point, of equal value, and then the consonant ones are also of an equal value, okay? So I'm going to take all the dissonant cognitions, right? These are dissonant with the idea that 2020 could still be a pretty great year. So COVID's ramping back up, that's dissonant with it. Polls were wrong before, that's dissonant with it, right? That doesn't fit with it. The Packers lost to the Vikings, that's just dissonant with it, right? I've got that weird skin thing, that's dissonant with it. Maybe there's a meteor coming towards Earth. All of those are dissonant with the idea that 2020 could still be a pretty great year. But then there are things that are consonant with this cognition. Well, first of all, there's still the possibility that Packers could go to the Super Bowl, right? The election's almost over, whichever way it's going, and that's going to be good in and of itself. Hey, Christmas is coming up. So all of these things are consonant with the idea that 2020 could still be a pretty great year. And so we add those together. And then in addition to that, we add all the dissonant cognitions back in, and we divide the dissonant cognitions with the total number of cognitions in the system, right? The consonant and the dissonant cognition. So we're really thinking about, well, how many cognitions end up going against this idea, and how many end up going for it or counting against it. So we're going to get a percentage in this way. If we divide these two things, our score will always be less than 1. Less than or equal to 1, or greater than or equal to 0, okay? So the scale of dissonance is going to run from 0 to 1 here, okay? A perfectly consonant belief would score 0. A perfectly dissonant one would score 1. The belief that 2020 could still be a pretty great year is a pretty dissonant belief, right? So it doesn't really fit together with the other beliefs in the system. We might say that it equals 0.625. Of course, I'm just creating a toy example here. But this is basically what Festinger's thinking is. We can sort of measure, at least theoretically speaking, at least, we can have this idea of this. We can take any single new belief the system might be introduced with, and at least know that it exists in some degree of dissonance with the system, or else it's perfectly consonant. Just for another example, suppose we're considering whether cigarettes are bad. Well, there are various dissonant cognitions to this, right? If I'm thinking cigarettes are bad, what doesn't go with that? Well, the fact that smoking looks cool, that smoking is relaxing, that like Joe Camel does it, like all of those things don't fit together with the belief that cigarettes are bad. They're dissonant. But then, of course, there are many consonant cognitions I have. Smoking causes emphysema, cigarettes are smelly, cigarettes are expensive, and so on. And then very dissonant cognitions. And then we add these dissonant cognitions back in, divide, and we get for this one that the idea that cigarettes are bad is less dissonant if these are the total relevant beliefs in the system. Okay, so in some way, we can think that the system would have a greater interest in dissolving the dissonance with the first of these beliefs, 2020 is going to be a pretty great year, than with the second, cigarettes are bad. Right? The fact that cigarettes are bad is somewhat dissonant. It doesn't sit as high in the dissonance scale, so we don't want to avoid it as much. Okay, so this is the thought that Festinger has, and this leads to two predictions. So the first is just basic dissonance reduction. So the thought is that people have a tendency to try to eliminate dissonance. And there are various ways they might do this. These are discussed in the McGrath article that you'll read in some detail. For example, they might change one or more of their other cognitions to try and make this one fit into the system better. And additionally, this suggests a kind of implication for forced compliance. And so this is really borne out in the paper, Festinger, Carl Smith, 1959, which I'm going to turn to in just a second. So they write, if a person is induced to do or say something which is contrary to his private opinion, there will be a tendency for him to change his opinion so as to bring it into correspondence with what he has done or said. Okay, so people will actually change their beliefs in light of the fact that they have behaved in some way that is inconsistent with their privately held opinion. Okay, so again, basic idea, dissonance produces discomfort, and correspondingly there will arise pressure to reduce or eliminate the dissonance. Festinger in his work thinks that there are basically 3 forms that this kind of dissonance reduction might take. The person may try to change the core target belief or cognition. So they may try to stop believing, for example, that cigarettes are bad. They may try to acquire new consonant information or beliefs that will cause the total dissonance to be reduced, right? So I might learn about more maladies arising from cigarettes that might help me make my belief that cigarettes are bad more consonant with the overall system, right? If I can find more things that support it, I'll reduce that fractional number that I got by thinking about how many consonant cognitions there were compared to how many dissonant. Or I can try to forget or reduce the importance of some of those cognitions that are dissonants, which will cause the total dissonance to be reduced, right? So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm either changing the target belief, the belief that I'm comparing to the system as a whole, or I'm acquiring new consonant beliefs, or I'm eliminating some of the dissonant beliefs that I have with that cognition. So in each of these three ways, I can influence or get rid of dissonance in my system. Okay, so an additional two predictions here. So the idea is that there's going to be a magnitude prediction that results from this. So the greater the dissonance, then the greater our drive to reduce it, right? As Festinger writes, the larger the pressure used to elicit the overt behavior beyond minimum needed to elicit it, the weaker will be the above mentioned tendency. And the thought is that this makes for a kind of smaller magnitude of dissonance. Okay, so let's consider their study here. Sorry, guys, I'm just realizing I went through this. So one prediction of this is dissonance reduction, right? The people have a tendency to try to eliminate dissonance. And then the additional prediction of the theory is magnitude, that the greater the dissonance, the greater the drive will be to reduce it. Sorry, I got a little bit off the rails there, so I think that makes more sense. So essentially, those are our two predictions. First of all, just that dissonance exists. If people have cognitions that don't fit together, then they'll try to remedy that in some of the ways that we mentioned, either by changing the target belief that is dissonant with the system, or by acquiring new consonant cognitions with that belief, or by eliminating some of the things that are dissonant with it that I already believe. And then additionally, the idea is that the greater the magnitude of dissonance, the more quickly or the more inclined we will be to address it. Okay, so let's look at a particular study here that convinces us of some of these facts, okay? So this study, again, is from Festinger and Carl Smith. And so they ask us to consider a person who privately holds opinion X, but as a result of pressures brought to bear on him, has now publicly stated that he believes not X, okay? So this is a kind of paradigm that will become very important later on in dissonance research. And so the idea is a kind of, well, if I can look up the term quickly from McGrath. Yeah, so the term is a counter-attitudinal essay, right? So the thought here is, this will become very important later on. We want to put someone in a position where they express a certain opinion, but it's not the opinion they actually hold. And in doing this, they will then give rise to dissonance because they'll know that they believe X, but they acted in a way that would suggest not X, okay? So they have this kind of dissonant perception. Their beliefs, what they know, doesn't fit together well. So in this original study in 1959 by Festinger and Carl Smith, they had their participants perform this series of incredibly annoying, tiring tasks, right? So what they would do is they would stack threads onto a tray, fill up the tray, move the tray to another place, stack the threads off, bring a new tray over, put the threads that they had put on the floor back on that tray, walk over, undo it, just do this over and over again for 30 minutes. Right, so move these spools of thread from place A to place B over and over again. Same spools going across the room. So I did that for 30 minutes. Then for 30 more minutes, they took a series of pegs and rotated each peg 45 degrees before they moved on to the next peg. They did this over and over for all the pegs continually for another 30 minutes, okay? So just imagine doing this. This is a very boring task. Being presented with this task, you would probably come to think that if this was a study that psychologists told you were participating in, you'd think this is like the most boring study ever. This is no good. So what do we find? What do we find? Well, definitely people in this study will have formed the belief that this was a boring task. But what happens is at the end of the test, they are told that the person who needs to introduce the next participant couldn't show up, okay? So they're asked if they could do it. Some people in one condition are given $20 to perform this task. Remember, this is in 1959, so that's a lot of money. People in another condition are given only $1 to perform the task. Almost everyone agrees to do it, so they agree to tell this person about the study, but they're both told to tell the person that the study was exciting, okay? Of course, no one thinks that that's the case. So the participants who end up doing this, who end up telling the next person that the study was exciting, have the belief that the study was in fact boring. But they also know that they said that the study was not boring, right? Now, additionally, believing that something is the case implies not saying that thing is false, or you shouldn't say things you don't believe. So it follows from this, as Festinger and his co-author say, that the person's cognition of his private belief is dissonant with his cognition concerning his actual public statement. Right? So what he said in private, or what he privately felt the study was boring, goes against what he said to this next poor schmuck who showed up to do the experiment. So these two cognitions do not, in fact, fit together. And so what do we have? Well, again, we have three conditions here. We have one person, or we people in a control who just come in and do the really boring part of this study, and they just leave. They're not told they have to talk to the next participant and tell them the study was exciting, sell them on the study. The people in a low dissonance condition, right, a condition in which their public behavior or what they know is not altogether that dissonant with the fact they told the participant the study was exciting, were the people who were paid $20, okay? So the people in the condition who were paid $20 are in a low dissonance condition because sure, they did lie to this person. They did say something they don't believe, but they had really good reason to do that. The fact that they were paid $20 goes a long way in explaining why they said this thing that they privately did not believe. And then people in a high dissonance condition are the people who are just paid $1 to talk to the next participant. So think about these people. They think, I know that study was so boring, but I told that person that it was exciting, and I didn't even have any good reason to do that. I was only paid $1. Okay, then these people were asked to rate afterwards the enjoyableness of the study and the scientific significance of the study. Okay, and they were also asked to assess how likely they would be to participate in this study again. So what we find is that those in the high dissonance situation, those who were only paid $1 to tell the next participant that the study they had found so boring was exciting, those people even actually after the fact rated the enjoyableness of the study and the scientific significance of the study as higher than those in the lower control condition. So what's going on here? Well, the thought is they're in this highly dissonant situation where they thought the study was terribly boring, and yet they told this other person that it wasn't for no good reason. So what do they have to do to bring all these dissonant cognitions in line with one another? Well, they actually come to think that the study that they participated in, the moving the threads, the twisting the pins, was actually more enjoyable and more scientifically significant than anyone else. So they come to actually change their beliefs. They change their cognitions to account for these dissonant cognitions. And indeed, those in the high dissonance condition were also more inclined to say that they would participate in such a study again. right? So if we want to think about this mapped out in the way that we were using before, we have the dissonant cognitions here. I told the next person the study was fun. And then we have the consonant cognitions we can compare to this, right? So I mean, the belief is that task was boring, right? Now, what's dissonant with my belief? What's dissonant with it is I told the next participant it was fun. There's some things that are consonant with it, right? I said it was fun to the next person, but the experimenters made me do it or told me to do that. I said it was fun, but they gave me $20. And we might think of this as being more weighty, like maybe this counts for 20 reasons, right? And so if we do that, we get like a much better or a much smaller aspect of dissonance in this case. Okay. Yeah, so that's the basic idea. These people, given the chance to, if they were paid less to perform this task, that to lie in this way or say something they don't believe is true, then they actually change their pre-existing beliefs in the how much they actually believe that that the task was fun. Okay, skipping on ahead. I want to end today by reflecting on this particular other book that Festinger puts forward, this other book on cognitive dissonance. And this book is really looking at the nature of doomsday cults, okay? The book is called When Prophecy Fails. It was published in 1956. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this. So doomsday cults, in a certain sense, provide the perfect test of cognitive dissonance. Because if you think about someone who's committed to a doomsday cult, well, what do they believe? They believe the earth is going to end at a certain soon to come date and time, right? And now, look, this is a perfect opportunity to set up dissonance. There's this thing they strongly, fervently believe, maybe, that the earth will end on this date, but most doomsday cults, or rather all doomsday cults so far, have been wrong, right? The earth has not ended on that specific date that was predicted whenever these predictions have been made in the past. So think about the people who are in that situation. They believe that this thing is going to happen, and now the whole world around them is a counterexample to this belief that they held deeply, right? They believe the world should have ended, but they wake up the next morning, the milkman's walking down the street, the children are there, and so on, right? So these people are in a terrible situation of cognitive dissonance. So what happens to them in this case, okay? So in this book, When Prophecy Fails, Festinger and his co-authors actually implanted themselves in a doomsday cult that was based in Chicago. So here is the story. Okay, actually, let's get back to this. So suppose you're in this doomsday cult and doomsday has come and gone without any doom whatsoever. So what can you then do to reduce the dissonance you're experiencing? Well, you can try to change the core target belief in the cult, so you can come to stop believing in the doomsday cult that told you the earth would end on this day. But you've already invested so much, and these stories and prophecy fails. They talk to people who have destroyed or sold or given away all of their possessions, right? So it's not easy to change that target belief in the cult. You can forget or reduce the importance of some of those cognitions that are dissonant with the beliefs you form. But look, this is a doomsday cult. They said the earth would end, and it's hard to ignore the continuing existence of the world. Finally, maybe you can acquire new consonant beliefs, which might reduce total dissonance overall, right? So you can come to form some new beliefs that will in some way increase the belief that the doomsday, or build up the belief that the doomsday cult was right. And then in that way, you'll reduce total dissonance. So you can come to believe that we just didn't pray hard enough to make it happen, or come to believe that we didn't convince enough new converts. And those beliefs, of course, have consequences. They lead to more religious fervor, right? So what is the prediction of when prophecy fails? The prediction is, for those people who aren't so deep in to the cult, they will change the target belief, right? They will stop believing in the cult, okay? We can't forget or reduce the importance of we can't forget or report or reduce the importance of the external world, although some people might think that the external world is actually a facsimile. That happens sometimes, these doomsday cults. But for those who are most invested, the likely outcome is going to be that they then acquire new consonant beliefs, which in fact increase their belief in the doomsday cult. They make their belief in that more strong, right? They add more beliefs to build onto it to overcome this kind of dissonant reaction. Okay? So, as they write, under the following conditions, we should expect fervor and proselytizing to arise as a response to dissonance. So first of all, the belief must be held with deep conviction. The individual must have made a commitment to the belief, undertaken an important action in favor of it, maybe giving away all their earthly possessions. The belief must be disconfirmable. There must be things that show it is not true, right? So maybe the earth is still there, right? You can imagine someone like thinking someone would win an election and that it's going to be prophesied by God, and then that being disconfirmed because they don't actually win the election. What would the upshot be? The belief must be disconfirmable, and then it must be also disconfirmed. A further thought is that the individual believer must have social support, right? So there must be other people who are on a similar page as you, so that you're not just left all alone and have to sort of abandon it because the pain of not having a social society is too great. But in all of those conditions, right, we can expect to see more fervor, more proselytizing, more fervor of belief in a religious figure or a political figure or whatever. Now, there are a variety of doomsday cults that satisfy these conditions through history that are discussed. The doomsday cult, though, that's mentioned in, or that's discussed primarily in When Prophecy Fails, is the doomsday cult of Miss Marian Keech. Okay, so this is how the cult is presented. In the book, they've changed people's names to protect their innocence here. Lake City is Chicago in this case. But the experimenters, Festinger and his colleagues, noticed this headline in the Chicago paper, Chicago Tribune, calling for this is in the classifieds, which they used to have in the papers, and it catches their attention. So here's the prophecy. Prophecy from Planet Clarion, call to city, flee that flood. It'll swamp us on December 21, outer space tells suburbanite. Or I guess it's just an article and not a classified. Lake City will be destroyed by a flood from the Great Lake just before dawn, Lake Michigan, December 21, according to a suburban housewife, Miss Marian Keech of 847 West School Street, says the prophecy is not her own. It is the purport of many messages she has received by automatic writing, she says. The messages, according to Mrs. Keech, are sent to her by superior beings from a planet called Clarion. These beings have been visiting the Earth, she says, in what we call flying saucers. During their visits, she says, they have observed fault lines in the Earth's crust that foretoken the deluge. Mrs. Keech reports she was told the flood will spread to form an inland sea stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Gulf of Mexico. At the same time, she says, a cataclysm will submerge the West Coast from Seattle, Washington to Chile and South America. So what happens when they study this cult? Well, in this book, ultimately what they find is that the people who believe in this cult, after the doomsday comes and passes, those who were sort of more periphery ultimately leave the cult, but those who are more deeply involved, who have given away possessions, go deeper in. And this religion, the Sanandans, actually still exists today. So people who are based off of this doomsday cult have now become a more legitimate religion. The doomsday part has been washed away, but it essentially grew out of this kind of strong, fervent core and support from one another who had made these big sacrifices. And in light of Festinger and colleagues' report, in light of this kind of failure of this belief that they could not reject, have to end up strengthening that belief by building a religion around it. I think this might suggest to us that maybe there are aspects of the doomsday cult in other major religions of the world. So I'm thinking here of Christianity as one example of this. So if we think about Matthew 24, chapter 24, verse 29, we have the following prediction. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give out its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son or of man in heaven. And then all the people of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now, learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Okay, so now, of course, generation may be taken figuratively, and I think that's how people have to take it now. But at the time this was written, perhaps it was written speaking of an actual generation. And perhaps people began to double down on the religion when that generation had passed, right? Anyway, I think this is an interesting anthropological idea to think about, the way in which perhaps cognitive dissonance has played a role in some of the actual major religions that we see today. I want to end today by thinking about, or inviting you to think about, what are some other instances involving cognitive dissonance that you can think of? I was thinking of some other examples, and I thought maybe fraternities are, like perhaps being tortured by these people causes you to think you love the fraternity more, that you want to be in it more than that. I mean, there's not as much hazing now as there used to be, of course. Gambling, right? Like, so maybe, all this punishment, all this loss can actually make you more likely to believe that gambling is a positive experience, right? To make sense of why you like it. I think we can think of our support of political parties in this way. Like maybe, I keep believing in these lousy politicians and they don't do anything for me. Why do I do it? Well, they must truly have the great ideas and be better than their opponents in all of these ways. I think we think of politics too, our love of political parties, if we have it, as being based in a kind of cognitive dissonance. I think there are possibly other examples as well. The McGrath article that you'll look at for this reading gives a kind of historical overview of cognitive dissonance, and then talks about various kinds of challenges and developments in the field. I invite you to look specifically at dissonance reduction strategies, which are discussed in some detail, and I think you'll have lots of questions. We can have lots of to talk about on those later in the week. And then also talks about the way in which dissonance reduction might be modeled and what are some different aspects of reduction. And so we can talk about all of that on Friday or on at whatever point we talk this week. And I look forward to talking to you soon. Goodbye.